Good evening, everybody, and welcome to what is the last in the October for Design programs. This month-long celebration of architecture, art, design, and community in New Canaan is generously put on by the town of New Canaan, and thank you to our sponsors, Marvin Windows, Rings End, and a special thanks to Laura Pla, one of the board of directors of the New Canaan Museum and Historical Society, for all the work she did over the course of the month to make this month-long celebration happen. Tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome Mark Markiewicz. He is a graduate of Princeton and the Princeton School of Architecture. He was a partner at Mitchell Jurgla in New York. He moved to New Canaan in 1992, where he lives with his family in a mid-century modern house. He received an AIA award for residential design for an addition he did to his own home. He's the former president of the board at the New Canaan Museum and Historical Society. He's been a docent at the biennial Modern House Day Tour, which the Society has put on for the past 20 years. He's also a regular docent at the Gores Pavilion here in town in Irwin Park. Mark has many talents. He is also an artist. His drawings of buildings at Princeton and Waveney have been shown at Princeton. And he's also had a collection of his houses and landmarks in New Canaan that were on exhibition in the Gores Pavilion called New Canaan Rendered. He's recently retired from Bienenfeld in New Rochelle, and he is the author of an upcoming book on Landis Gores. I'm very pleased to welcome Mark.
Thank you, Nancy, and good evening. And let's get started. Okay, where? Oh, share screen, yes. Oh, wait a second. Click on this. Yeah. What's going on? Oh, there it is. Okay, great. This is okay now? You're sharing. Your screen is sharing, right? Okay, so we can start. All right, well, let's get started. The idea behind this presentation is to gain a little more insight on the New Canaan's mid-century modern architecture by going beyond New Canaan and looking at the work of other architects of the same period. Eero Saarinen was a giant of mid-century American architecture, and the bulk of his work coincided precisely with the heyday of New Canaan's modern architects. It was the 1950s and the early 60s. During the 50s, Saarinen produced an extraordinary body of work that was both at the forefront of modern design and yet clearly distinct from that of his peers. Born and raised in Finland, educated at Yale, his persona could have been a model for Howard Rourke of the Fountainhead, as he produced grand ideas and had the influence with the corporate world to implement them. His vision encompassed a wide definition of design that included not only architecture, but also master planning and furniture. His search was to give form to what was idealized as the 20th century lifestyle and all its technology-driven aspects. Sleek automobile design, carefree domestic landscape, space exploration, and even the popular Jetson comics fueled the optimistic 1950s. The architectural form that Saarinen pursued was often inspired by the industrial mode of production and included projects as diverse as the St. Louis Arch, the CBS headquarters in New York, the Ingalls hockey rink at Yale, and multiple lines of furniture. Eero Saarinen had a spectacular but a relatively brief career. In 1961, at the young age of 51, while his firm was at its busiest, he was suddenly struck by a brain tumor and died. Projects on the drafting boards were continued well into the 60s, and realized by the firm's exceptionally talented group of associates. Some, like Cesar Pelli, Kevin Roche, John Dinkeloo, and Gunnar Burkert, went on to establish their own distinguished careers. For a deeper appreciation of Saarinen's enormous talent, it is worth to look at his background and the cultural milieu around him. He was born in Finland in 1910 into a remarkably gifted family. His father, Eero Saarinen, an almost exact contemporary of Frank Lloyd Wright, was a well-established architect in Helsinki, and his mother was a sculptor and a weaver. Throughout his youth and education, Eero was surrounded by the evolving architectural themes of his parents. However, it is especially revealing to see how different his future vision materialized. The architecture of the elder Saarinen was evocative of the times and expressive of the particular northern Scandinavian culture. Finland, which did not become an independent country until 1917, was under the dominance of Tsarist Russia, and in reaction, the overwhelming mood among the population was to establish its own identity. Architects pursued that goal through design unique to their culture, often referred to as national romanticism. Eliel's work was a collage expressed in a dialogue between classical antiquity that symbolized clarity and humanity, and Gothicism to convey depth and intensity of feeling. The Helsinki train station was a synthesis of Saarinen's ideas on civic architecture. The sculptural massing and bold detail surely fulfilled the Finnish aspirations for a strong and dignified national identity. The rich composition is both classical in its axial organization and Gothic in its vertical proportions. Furthermore, Saarinen's architecture engaged a world much greater than just buildings. As shown in the watercolors of these two interiors, it was a vision of architecture that articulates and connects every aspect of design. There is a distinct continuity between structure, spatial quality, furniture, colors, and textures. It was a holistic vision promoting a modern lifestyle that sprung from a singular ideology. Early 20th century was a very exciting time for architecture when traditions were jostled and shaped by emerging powerful movements like Art Nouveau, early modernism, and the arts and crafts movement, all competing to define a true path for the future of society. Saarinen was quite aware of the diversity of these international ideas, and his architecture took on the quality of a rich tapestry, sensitively crafted in a way that avoided simplistic eclecticism. From the early 1900s on, Saarinen's work and family life centered around Fikräsk, a multi-family residence and studio compound that he and his partner Geselius and Lindgren built for themselves. It was a place of intense artistry where the young Eero Saarinen was immersed in surroundings that were thoughtfully crafted in natural wood, stone, textiles, and color, all elements of national romanticism and specifically expressive of the Karelian movement, which was fundamentally a moral longing for the unspoiled peasant culture of Karelia, an eastern province of Finland. The multi-family compound, home to the three partners and their families, was a mini artist colony where life and work intermingled. In the elevation drawing above, the central studio was flanked by the articulated apartments of the families. In the lower photo, we see Pipsan, Eero's older sister, in the middle of the studio working alongside her father. The spacious common areas were a showcase of design and experimentation and an ongoing effort to define and burnish the national character of Finland. The design of interiors, furnishings, and household objects was shaped by an arts and crafts sensibility using natural materials. In case you're notice the excessive use of logs, it's interesting to note that the original log cabin that is associated with the American frontier came from Finland, and it was first recorded in a Swedish settlement in Delaware in 17th century sometime. A defining moment for the elder Saarinen was coming to America in 1923. The reason was a very significant international competition for the Chicago Tribune headquarters. While his entry received second prize, as it was judged too radical and modern to be built, its telescoping, supremely elegant, monumental design exerted a huge influence on American skyscrapers and can be seen today across the iconic skyline of American cities. What stands out about this design is an unswerving simplicity and purity of an idea, a quality that shaped the future work of the younger Saarinen. In the course of Saarinen's stay in Midwest, Eliel met George Booth, a Detroit newspaper baron, and soon afterwards, the Cranbrook Schools project was launched in Bloomfield Hills, a suburb of Detroit. It was a very fruitful association as both men came with highly complementary motives. Booth's fascination with craft, production, and its role in society found a home with Saarinen's richly inclusive architecture. In an era of searching for utopian communities, the Cranbrook vision was to establish an educational environment which would culminate in a setting for artists. Its overriding purpose was to promote individual exploration and growth. In other words, it was not to be a school that taught how to make artistic objects, but to provide a fertile environment for experimentation and individual expression. For Saarinen, Cranbrook was a vast new Fitrask in the new world. Saarinen's passion for exploring new design ideas resulted in an amazing architecture throughout the three separate schools within the Cranbrook institution. Witnessed by young Eero Saarinen, who was around 14 at the time, the successive and architecturally distinct campuses were built. Cranbrook School for Boys in 1927, in this image, Kingswood School for Girls in 1931, and the Art Academy in 1939. As seen in the following images, what is remarkable is the distinct character of each campus and a search within the classical and Gothic sources. Such agility of architectural vision was to become young Eero's approach to design. Cranbrook School, a campus of red brick and cut stone, has a vaguely Scandinavian Gothic quality with an emphasis on the vertical and an aesthetic expressive of how things are constructed. There is clarity of volume, scale, and articulation of the different parts of the buildings, which are never isolated monuments, but are linked together to define a hierarchy of open spaces and vistas. The robust and rustic imagery of the earlier works in Finland evolved into a crisp and consistent composition enriched by cut stone and intricate brick patterns. As in this view of the dining hall, the geometric volumes are distinct with decorative elements concentrated to emphasize their individual identity. The intersection of the separate building wings are highlighted by intricate detail and finer scale. A symbolic canopy of sculpted stone and wrought iron marks a significant spot on the campus. Kingswood School, built in 1931, is a radical departure in design and illustrates a search for an authentic American architecture. The school is often compared with Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie Houses. Unlike the intricate texture of the School for Boys, here the design palette coalesced into simpler, well-proportioned volumes with a distinct emphasis on the horizontal profile, accentuated by strategically placed articulated and decorated elements such as telescoping chimneys and fluted structural pillars. This is how the campus looks today. Kingswood was a workshop for the development of a new aesthetic that aimed to integrate modernity with nature, history, and craft, which of course was an anathema to the modern ideals, but did not keep the elder Saarinen from trying to find common ground. Finally, the Art Academy, built in 1939, displays a cooler sensibility with a synthesis of classical and international style directness and simplicity. The site plan is organized along a central axis of water features and is also a showcase for sculpture, a major component of the curriculum. The intersection of the water spine and the buildings is marked by a generous pavilion-like loggia, flanked by the museum wing on the left and the library on the right. The campus is dotted with cineast sculptures of the Swedish sculptor Carl Milles. The bold curving forms of these works may have influenced young Saarinen's future vision. The vocabulary of the Art Academy is a stripped-down classicism reminiscent of the interwar Italian architecture, an elegant and serene vision that sought to blend modernity with classical rigor. Each campus is a testament to Saarinen's amazing ability to navigate design between three separate ideologies and take the architectural language of each to a highly developed and mature conclusion. The architecture is highly detailed and integrated with equally developed landscape. Saarinen liked to remind colleagues to always consider one scale up and one down. So for example, the design of a room must take into account the design of the furniture, as well as its surroundings, including the exterior landscaping. Incidentally, such continuity of the design is at the core of Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. Young Eero Saarinen, of course, was a witness and eventually a participant in this process. Before entering Yale in 1931, he worked on these projects in his father's office. After graduating from Yale in 1934, Saarinen went to Paris to study sculpture at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, followed by working in Helsinki for Carl Eklund, an architect whose work was a Scandinavian version of the international style. In the late 30s, he returns to Michigan to work in his father's office. The images of Eero Saarinen work I have chosen attempt to summarize the enormous diversity in approach to design throughout his career. Rather than a full inventory, it is a limited sampling of his work to illustrate his agile design methodology. As his father did at Cranbrook, Eero's was a passionate resolve to define each design problem on its own merit and express it with a unique solution in form and material. However, the structures are also a radical departure from the fundamental character of the schools. While Cranbrook is rich in its layering and complexity of architectural themes, Eero Saarinen's designs tend to be expressed with a singular architectural idea that is executed with supreme confidence. Simultaneously, the works have distinct personalities, and at times they can be cool, serene, perhaps aloof, and other times full of explosive energy and dynamism. Furthermore, Eero's engagement with new technology set him apart from his father and many other architects of the era. Maxwell Fry, the renowned British architect, succinctly describes the ultimate challenge for modern architecture. He quotes, while the technological advancement was the core of modern architecture, its pace of development was far greater than the capacity for artistic assimilation. I find that to be an amazing statement, amazing observation. It makes one think of in contrast to architecture, of something like the automobile industry, where the cars started looking like carriages, or horseless carriages as they were actually called, and in a relatively short time developed an aesthetic and developed into streamlined missiles that captured the sense of speed and a smooth ride. Assimilation of architecture with technology was not a problem for young Saarinen, as he took up this challenge with gusto. In a most general way, Saarinen's projects fall within two diametrically opposed tendencies. On the one hand, a strict rigor of a gridded modular space, and on the other, extremely sculptural forms. His work fluctuated between the two, but never confused one with the other, as each project clearly projected its own unique personality. IBM Complex on the left and TWA Terminal on the right illustrate this dichotomy. Kleinhaus Music Hall in Buffalo, New York was built in 1940. It is an early project done in collaboration with his father and shows experimentation with using form to express the internal functions of the program. The two major components of the building are curved volumes that follow the internal shapes of the large music hall, and a small chamber music space. They're joined by a two-story lobby in between. This building, referred to by the two Saarinens, are deriving from a music or instrument, such as a cello, is defined by sweeping gestures and set the tone for much of young Saarinen's future work. In 1945, General Motors commissioned both Saarinens to draw up a master plan for a state-of-the-art, ultra-sophisticated research center in Warren, Michigan. It grew into a massive project that continued through final construction in 1956. Planning and design for their 320-acre facility began in 1945. Originally inspired by the Cranbrook site plan on the left, the overall design direction took a radically different turn in 1947, as shown in the sketch in the middle. Unlike the intricate campus fabric of Cranbrook, the GM plan became a serene composition around a giant 22-acre pool with surrounding buildings maintaining their individual pristine forms while defining grand exterior spaces. The architecture had to clearly express the client's program and goal for precision. It is an extensive display of an early use of industrial materials, such as windows with neoprene gaskets to symbolize automobile windshields, porcelain enamel metal panels, stainless steel curtain wall and glazed brick in different colors used to distinguish between the separate research groups. By the way, the colors of the glazed brick were developed by the Cranbrook Art Academy potters. Saarinen has been referred to as the master of the Jetson cool, and indeed he was. The General Motors facility was intended to foster boundless innovation and fantasy toward automobile design. The vast pool has in it a distinct vertical accent, a striking, beautiful water tower. Looks like I am right over that. Here one can see the synthesis of Saarinen's design sensibility, a graceful form, the shape of the elliptical water tank, a robust sense of the structure of the triangular relationship of the three pylons, intricate sense of detail in the lower connecting brackets, and finally the gleaming industrial skin of the stainless steel. Oh, I can move that. Oh, that's better. Sorry about that. In 1956, Kresge Auditorium was built on the MIT campus. Saarinen placed a dome in the middle of a large open area, which allowed its uniquely modified shape to be appreciated from a distance as well as various angles. Its form echoes the other shallow domes on the campus seen in the background. All functions are contained within the dome and are compressed to create the intended effect of a close relationship between the audience and the stage. The design concept was conceived as two interlocking sections of a sphere, like the two shells of a clam, one for the roof and one for the seating. The assertive sculptural form of the roof is constructed as a very thin concrete shell, only 3.5 inches at its apogee, and is a predecessor to the later TWA terminal. Saarinen claimed that it was Mies van der Rohe's principle in establishing an absolute clarity of structure that was guiding motive for the form, but we'll have more on that later. In contrast to the cool exterior, the inside is a dramatic and sensuous and a perfect setting for a memorable performance. In 1957, Miller House was built in Columbus, Indiana. Irwin Miller was a wealthy industrialist and a promoter of modern design. During his tenure as head of Cummins Engine, he sponsored vast number of prominent architects whose work dotted, and still dots, the town with striking modern buildings. As this was a time when dozens of modern houses were also sprouting in New Canaan, it is worth taking a closer look at the Miller House. The house project was a collaboration of three great design talents. With Saarinen at the helm, Dan Kiley, the renowned landscape architect of serene park-like settings, and Alexander Girard, a prolific interior designer with a maximalist sensibility, created an integrated living environment in the exuberant spirit of the picturesque compound. The beauty of the floor plan on the left lies in its simplicity. Like an urban square at an intersection of two city streets that extend to distant vistas, in this case, Dan Kiley's garden, the central living areas are clearly defined by the four clusters of private and service spaces. The particular zones within the living area are free-flowing and overlook each other. The pinwheel arrangement is highlighted by a grid of linear skylights shown in blue, which crisscross the spaces, defining their particular functions and strategically bring diffuse light to the interior. The power, I'm going to move myself for a second. The power of this simple idea has historical roots in Palladio's Villa Rotunda on the upper right, and below a striking parallel with John Johansson's Bridge House in New Canaan in 1956. The living area has distinct places accentuated by beams of light from the linear skylights above. Light from the above clearly defines the various sitting areas and in places washes the walls that are meant for prominence. The conversation pit, an icon of the 50s, conveniently recesses into the floor to allow for an uninterrupted view to Dan Kiley's lush landscape beyond. The flat roof extends on all four sides, creating a modern-day open porch, which also provides effective sun control to the interior and a gracious transition from built form to intensified nature. Clarity and articulation of structure is one of the tenets of modern architecture, and so the columns are often freestanding. In the Miller House on the far left, columns are celebrated in their prominent location, centered on the intersections of the skylight grid above. In the middle, we see in a house in New Canaan by Marcel Breuer, a row of freestanding columns follows along the interior of the exterior wall. And on the right, Landis Gore's Pavilion has a row of columns along the exterior of the house. A low-slung, expansive one-story house was popular during the mid-century era, and it is interesting to see parallels with other houses of the times. Bottom images show two houses by New Canaan's John Black Lee, both under one flat roof with deep overhangs and similar wraparound porches. Ingles Hockey Rink at Yale was built in 1959 and represents a new phase in Saarinen's vision, the exploration of organic forms by pushing the envelope of structural capacity of reinforced concrete. Here, the undulating roof is supported by a giant 200-foot-long concrete arch that spans from front to the back. Saarinen's early sketch captures the intended character of the structure. Like in a suspension bridge, the arch beam is stabilized by multiple tensile cables, which also support the roof membrane made up of wood planks. The three elements form an integrated whole, expressing clarity of structure combined with interesting detail of the textured plank ceiling, which you see on the right here. The central beam continues on to the outside to provide structural counterweight and simultaneously announces the entry. This is an improvement over the Kresge Auditorium, where, if you recall, the pure form of the truncated dome ignored the presence of the entry that was limited to just plain doors floating in the uniform curtain wall. Constructed over 6 years between 1956 and 62, the TWA terminal at the JFK airport is a culmination of Saarinen's passion for lyrical form. The building is an allegory of flight and concrete. Unlike today, air travel in those days was something special, and the building is a gateway to that experience. Inside, the space flows continuously from one area to the next, defining an architecture of fluidity. The interior is bright and airy, and the potentially cavernous effect is neutralized by ample daylight from huge curtain walls along the perimeter. Soaring walkways enable the visitor to experience the space from all angles. At the Dulles International Airport near Washington, D.C., built in 1962, one can see echoes of both the Ingles Rink and TWA as sculpture and structure become integrated. It is a singular gesture of structural clarity. Two rows of giant pylons hold up a sweeping roof membrane supported by cables. Instead of a relatively modest beak-like porte-cochere drop-off at TWA, here a giant colonnade greets the visitor. The inclined pylons and the roof overhang create an inviting sense of shelter while providing the necessary structural counterweight to the roof. Inside, the concave curve of the ceiling catches the diffuse light as it changes in the course of the day and suggests a wonderful soft cloud as it beckons the traveler to the journey ahead. The headquarters for the Deere Company in Moline, Illinois was built in 1963. The nature of this company, a large manufacturer of farm machinery, prompted Saarinen to search for an appropriate image, so he stated that it should be, quote, bold and direct, strong and basic, not slick, precise, glittering glass and spindly metal, unquote. For the exterior wall, Saarinen chose a high tensile steel alloy which oxidizes to a protective coating and thus eliminates the need for repainting. The product became known by its trade name Corten steel. The building is like a giant machine whose industrial image is intensified by its siting amidst a park-like rolling landscape. It is a machine in the garden that symbolizes the inherent challenge to nature posed by the industrial age. Inside, likewise, the interiors celebrate the machine by keeping the structure exposed, but clearly organized to define the grand spaces. To further accentuate the sought-after robustness of the image, external sunscreens were added to give the building a highly articulated and bold profile. The CBS headquarters, built in New York City in 1965, is a monumental building in Manhattan clad in dark granite and glass that emphatically stands out from its undistinguished glass-clad neighbors. The pure form of the tower has a strong vertical profile defined by triangular granite pillars. There is a wonderful proportional balance between the solid granite and the glass that creates an overall effect of tension that is absent in the surrounding glass towers. One can sense an echo of the elder Saarinen's Chicago Tribune design. The uncompromising purity of form from top to bottom was also its vulnerability, as it was criticized for not allowing a clearly defined entry. This, by the way, was an endemic problem to modern architecture, where often the purity of the form dominated and prevented the acknowledgement of things like entries or windows. The St. Louis Arch, completed in 1968, is the centerpiece of the Jefferson National Memorial commemorating the Louisiana Purchase. It was a national competition that took place in 1947, with Eero's father participating separately. Incidentally, when Eero was chosen, the winner, they first mistakenly notified Allele, his father. While the General Motors complex is representative of Saarinen's strict modular rigor, the arch is pure lyricism. It is an exquisite structure, an equilateral triangle in cross-section that is simultaneously feather-light and monumental. Unlike a traditional triumphal arch built to welcome back conquering armies, this is a gate to the future and the boundless optimism associated with it. It conjures up covered wagons streaming out to the west. Furniture design was a constant pursuit for Saarinen. As with his father, who considered furniture to be integral to the architectural environment, Saarinen's furniture parallel his buildings. His exquisite chairs and tables are a product of his typical consistent ideology. One of the iconic images is Saarinen's womb chair, shown here with him in it. He was, however, troubled by the legs, which he considered to be formally gratuitous. He noted, "I wanted to make the chair all one thing again," and the result was a single leg supported tulip line of furniture in the lower right. The transfer of ideas from architecture to design and vice versa reinforced Saarinen's belief in achieving formal unity to his vision of the 20th century environment. The fact that the tulip chair and the TWA terminal share a similar concept, the fusion of structural elements into a single self-determining form, is at the core of Saarinen's holistic approach to design. Looking back on the 1950s, it was a time of great optimism fueled by a steady surge in technological advancement, with America leading the way. Modern architecture came into the mainstream and was enthusiastically embraced by corporate America, which realized that a modern image could be a very valuable public relations tool. Steel and glass of the United Nations, the Lever House, and even Philip Johnson's Glass House symbolized the norm. However, the success of modern architecture had within it the seeds of its decline and eventual transformation and rebirth, I might add. In the 60s, the mood grew much darker as Vietnam erupted, and the children of the 50s adopted a counterculture that squarely rejected the previous sense of optimism and confidence in progress. Architecturally, the freshness of the gleaming glass forms was replaced by the monotony of New York's 6th Avenue repetitive office towers, sited in the isolation of their empty plazas, which came to be viewed as not much more than the packaging of the workplace. Oops. There were exceptions, of course, like Jorn Utzon's Sydney Opera House, an exuberant celebration of music and water. Incidentally, that highly expressive complex was made possible by Eero Saarinen, who was on the jury panel in selecting Utzon for the project. Furthermore, Utzon's own career parallels that of Saarinen's in the uniquely fresh approach to individual projects. Eero Saarinen was controversial and had his share of detractors. Princeton professor David Billington was one. Billington, a civil engineer, strongly objected to the work's implication that Saarinen's buildings derived from structural principles, whereas in fact, they required much structural gymnastics to achieve their lighter-than-air soaring image. Billington's favorite example was the Kresge Auditorium, which he claims was inspired when Saarinen was peeling an orange. The result was much trouble with the Kresge, including constant roof leaks and cracking as the structure moved because of its structurally unnatural shape. For completely different reasons, Yale professor Vincent Scully also dismissed Saarinen. In his book, American Architecture and Urbanism, his criticism of the Ingalls hockey ring expressed the prevailing public sentiment that the architecture of the day was hopelessly preoccupied with its own isolated form, detached from its context, and destructive to the urban fabric. He stated, quote, "The urbanistic effect of the whole was disastrous, the street destroyed. The only site such a building could have occupied was the top of a gentle hill in the open. Instead, it was set at the foot of a hill among other buildings. In all these ways, it embodied a good deal that was wrong with American architecture in the mid-1950s. Exhibitionism, structural pretension, self-defeating urban arrogance," unquote. Scully's opinion was echoed the mood among architects, and the ideals of a modern vision took a radically different course. The prevailing inspiration was history, pioneered, among others, by Princeton's Robert Venturi. The idea that buildings are individual monuments gave way to a redefinition of architecture as being fragments of a greater whole. Venturi's thesis proposed that building should aspire to be what he called a decorated shed. He illustrated this notion by pointing to a folly of a restaurant on Long Island that is literally shaped like a giant duck, or in other words, a sculpture that is detached from its surroundings. As Scully would say, it displays a self-defeating urban arrogance. Unfortunately, this drift quickly developed into a parody of itself and became known as postmodernism, symbolized by Philip Johnson's AT&T headquarters. Oops. Fortunately, its freewheeling festival of historical motifs proved too frivolous for something as lasting as architecture and faded away. And by the way, Scully did come around to appreciate Saarinen and apologized posthumously, but publicly. Today, to some extent, the pendulum has swung back and architecture has regained a sense of experimentation and courage in form making and the use of materials. However, the works that emerge today are a whole different animal than Saarinen's constructions. Unlike projects such as TWA, whose spatial freedom and fluidity followed strict geometry, such as overall symmetry, and strove towards unity between form and structure on the top, today's architecture is a free-form expression that is often like an assemblage of found objects. The Lewis Science Library at Princeton by Frank Gehry is a confluence of forms, shapes, colors, and textures, and comes together into a picturesque collage with seeming ease and freedom. It may be delightful to look at, but only thanks to Frank Gehry's artistic talent. This approach in another's hand would be a true train wreck. Although Saarinen's career was brief, it is difficult to imagine an architect who was more responsible for creating a more articulate vision of the mid-20th century architecture and design, nor to underestimate his continuing influence on 21st century architects. As personal as the design of Zaha Hadid, Santiago Calatrava, and Norman Foster are, they owe a profound debt to the lyrical, fluid, and dynamic works of Eero Saarinen. Here we have Hadid's cultural center in Baku, Azerbaijan on top, Calatrava's transportation hub in downtown New York on the left, and Foster's Apple headquarters in Cupertino, California. In conclusion, a few words about the title. Eero Saarinen, a driven search for an American architecture. Saarinen's vision was inextricably intertwined with the post-war era in America. His boundless enthusiasm for diving into new directions with confidence and optimism paralleled the optimism of the society and the surge of technological progress that shaped American lifestyle. Saarinen's architecture often inspired insight into design. He had the ability to channel the enormous complexities of major buildings into the purity of a single idea. From furniture to structure, there was an unwavering sense of purpose and clarity. And why driven? Most of us, when we find a good idea, we stick with it. Saarinen had a kind of restlessness that propelled him to approach each design project afresh. It was not reinventing the wheel for its own sake, but rather a passion for understanding how things work and reaching out for the ideal expression. Thank you. And now, if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Or if you're like me and think of something later, you can email me. My email is mjmarkiewicz@gmail.com.
We have one question already that is, who was his favorite structural engineer?
Yes, the, oh my gosh. Slips my mind. Yes, it was a New York engineer. Oh gosh, I couldn't reach the complete blank. I'll think of it in a minute. No.
Okay. Okay.
If I think of it, I'll come back with it.
And the other question that came in is, did Mies van Dro ever comment on his work?
He may have. As I mentioned before, it was a time when new architecture was emerging, and I'm sure all architects were aware of each other and in contact with each other. Mies van der Rohe came to New York often, and also in connection with the Seagram's building and major exhibits put together by Philip Johnson at the Museum of Modern Art. So their paths most likely crossed. As I mentioned, Saarinen was an admirer of Mies van der Rohe and especially admired the clarity of structure. So chances are that there was conversation between the two.
How did his Midwestern roots affect his architecture?
Well, I would say his roots are really Finnish because he was in Finland during his teens. He came to America in 1923, so he was 13 years old. But I think they started in Finland. After all, he was surrounded by the work of his father and his partners. You know, he was surrounded by these wonderful, gigantic renderings and watercolors and you know, just incredible work all around him. But then when they came to US, I think his biggest impact was witnessing the 3 Cranbrook schools being designed and built. Their individual character and pursuit of their own sort of design principles was, I think, the most influential. That's probably is the key.
What was your experience learning in a Saarinen design campus? What was your favorite memory?
Well, how did you know I was actually, that question speaks to, I have actually went to high school in Cranbrook. So I was not in the art academy, but in the first school that Saarinen built, which is a fantastic campus, and also close with the other campuses, the girls' school, of course, and the art academy was right next door. One of the striking things when you're in the middle of Cranbrook is the kind of the richness of the intricate texture of the place. I mean, the brickwork is unbelievable. You must have used bricks that range from sort of standard size to Roman brick to tiny little slivers of bricks that formed this very rich texture and patterns and designs all over the different buildings. So that was probably the first one. And then going to Kingswood, it was a whole different world. It was like, you know, it was a little bit more of an Art Deco or, you know, a whole different vision, and, you know, with sweeping spaces and, you know, clean spaces and very detailed in sort of concentrated ways, but in total contrast to Cranbrook.
So do you have a favorite memory?
Well, yes, the whole place was a favorite. I mean, you know, in terms of being influenced, and I mean, Cranbrook was clearly a historic place and was really kind of close to the romantic, national romanticism of Finland. So it was a different age. I mean, we're looking, you know, forward. We're, you know, I live in a mid-century modern house that I worked on. So, you know, the ideals and criteria are, you know, more modern than the Bauhaus that might have been associated with the early Saarinen.
Okay, well, Mark, thank you very, very, very much. Again, if you have questions for Mark, you can either contact the Historical Society and we can get to him, or you can email him directly. Thank you all for participating. Have a wonderful weekend and good night.
Thank you.